soldiers, sailors, and airmen. You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. The free men of the world are marching together to victory.
Hello folks, welcome back to World War II TV. And it's a funny thing, I was just thinking to myself, when I started this channel 3 years ago, it seemed that 2 out of 3 shows, 3 out of 4 shows were about Normandy because it's where I live and that's what I was doing. I was sending out the people I know to go and film at places and talk about things we knew about. And this year, it seems that Normandy doesn't happen quite as often. We don't often talk about it. We've been to Sicily, we've been to North Africa, we've been across the Pacific, but it's back to Normandy again today. So we are talking about the welcome return of Arthur back to our channel to talk about his 2 volume books. Well, he's actually going to talk about one small part of one of the books there, but these are the books there, bloody VerrieRes. The links to them are in the description below. As you know, Arthur focuses on the German side and the Allied side. And we're going to talk about the 5 battles for Tilly-la-Campagne today. So that's what we're going to do. If you're new to the channel, I had a few newbies in the last few days. Welcome aboard. All the information you always need is in the description below. Maybe you would consider becoming a patron or a channel member. But without further ado, I'm going to bring Arthur in. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Oh, doing great. Thank you very much for having me on again.
Well, thanks for being here. And folks, we've got video footage I took last week. And my takeaway, and Colin, who's watching this, who was driving me and standing in the fields with me, is for a tiny village that is a kind of a blink and you miss it village that's just sort of in between places of interest, which is a sort of an odd way of looking at it. A hell of a lot happened in this little village. And so I'm really pleased that you're putting a spotlight on it. So when you're studying, before we bring up the PowerPoint and start, when you're studying these battles, south of Caen, there's a lot of baggage as a Canadian to go through because it's a campaign that people have talked about negatively, positively over the years. What you seem to have done is kind of wiped the slate clean, gone back to archives and built the cases again. During that whole process, and we were talking about your few future books just before we went online there, were there any kind of single things that stood out that you learnt in reassessing it? Single things about that campaign that kind of strike you, or is it a case of lots of little things you learnt?
There's tons of little things, but often it's very striking the similarities between the infantry tactics of 1918 and the infantry tactics of 1944. There were some new vehicles, new technology, new weapons, and of course fighter bombers cruising over the battlefield. Powerful Sherman tanks driving around, but in some ways, the 303 Lee Enfield and the way infantry companies went about doing their business was still very much, World War I. There hadn't been, there's 1918, 1944, not a huge amount of years between those two seminal World War, time frames.
That's exactly what Colin and I were saying. We were standing in the field between Bourguébus and Tilly-la-Campagne last week, and we were saying, with all the tech at the Allies' disposal by 1944, we're breaking German codes with Ultra. We've got SOE using gadgets across the world. We've got incredible aircraft carriers. We've got tanks. We've got tank destroyers. We've got hollow charges. And yet, how often does it seem to come down to, men with rifles fixing bayonets and walking through wheat fields, either in the dark or in bright sunshine towards a dug-in position? We were scratching our heads. But as it came up with Peter Hart early in the week about Italy, is that's how wars are won. It doesn't matter what tech you've got flying in the air, until you've put boots on the ground, until you've walked across and actually liberated a place by those infantry grunts or GIs or Tommies or whoever they would be, a place isn't really seized. So we'll be talking about that today. So folks, we have video footage for you today, but we've also got Arthur's PowerPoint, and we will kind of try and deal with your questions as we're going through, because we will, but I'm also juggling video clips and PowerPoint and talking to Arthur, so bear with me because it's a bit of a technical change for me. But set the scene for us, Arthur, about this area before the war, because we're talking about an area that today has nearly been swallowed up by Caen. But talk about the area then.
Certainly, there's Tilly-la-Campagne is a village with a T-junction in it. There's a road, the D230, that runs north to Bourguébus, the famous Bourguébus Ridge. And of course, the Bourguébus Ridges in which the massive British armored assault of 18th July collapsed against, was the first Ss-Panzerdivision Leibstandarte was sent against it. But the village pre-war is roughly about 100 people. And it's very much an agricultural farming community. All the farmers live in the village, and their fields are surrounding it. Of course, apart from one farm that's to the northwest, and there's other farms to the northeast. One of the ones to the northeast is the Ferme Mézy. And then there's the other big industry, apart from flax and wheat and cattle and dairy farms in Normandy, that is mining, which is the big iron ore mines all spread around Normandy, and they honeycomb part of VerrieRes-Ridge. And you have the famous Chemin de Fer Minier railroad line that runs north-south right out of Caen and runs right beside Tilly-la-Campagne. And there's a flat railroad stop there, a railroad crossing, and other parts of the railroad are raised. They're forming sort of a geographical barrier. And then to the left, we have the Route Nationale 158, which is a paved 2-lane road, very modern by 1930s French fashion. And then there's the larger villages around of Garcelles-Secville, Secville-la-Campagne, Bourguébus, Bras, Solières, Rocancourt, all around it, which are very similar to Tilly and similar to Verrieres, but just a little bit larger. And then to the south, you see some wooded areas, and to the east. And of course, these are where the German tanks love to hide, and they have their tank parks. And of course, the Germans are very much waiting at this time for another Operation Goodwood to emerge, another massive tank assault. But this time the Germans figure, well, we're ready now. And we've moved in these massive armored forces in the way of parts of the 2nd Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 1st SS Panzer Division, bits and pieces of what's left of the 12th SS Panzer Division, and to the south, the 9th SS Panzer Division and 10th, which are partly across the river, but can and will be moved to the east to fight on this battlefield against the next big Allied operation, an Anglo-Canadian operation, but mainly Canadian, and that's how Canadian military historians view it, Operation Spring. Sorry if I went off track there a little bit talking about other things, but...
Absolutely perfect. And what we're going to do is we're going to just play a little video kind of introducing the battlefield, because I said Colin and I walked it last week, and it's mostly flat, but there are these slightly kind of depressions and undulating bits where as you're walking around, you realize from one bit you can see the village, and you go down the road a bit and you can't see the village because it's dropped behind a little bit of a ridge, or the wheat is too high there. So we're going to play this kind of introductory little clip here, which just kind of gives, I was driving, well, Colin was driving, I was looking out the window. So as you say, Arthur, we're talking wheat, we're talking flax, and this is the battlefield, just to give you a bit of introduction to what we're talking about. And while that's playing off, I think, we are going to be focusing on these key dates, but I think some people perceive that kind of July-August battle as being static, except on the days when the big operations are being launched. But of course, there are these little small incursions and movements, and I think that's something that you bring to light in your books.
Yes, a lot of these little villages are very much fought over. May-sur-Orne fought over, Tilly-la-Campagne, La Hogue, Verrieres. Just on the days where the big operations don't take place, there's still these minor attacks and German counterattacks that receive maybe 2 or 3 lines within an official history, but are actually somewhat fierce battles. And we see, looking at the video here, you see the difficulty. If you're an infantryman, there's nowhere to hide. So you see a lot of these attacks occurring at night to give the infantry some kind of advantage. But it's even worse if you're a tank commander. It's excellent if you're a defender, because, with your binoculars, your German Zeiss binoculars, naval binoculars, you're sitting in the turret of a Panzer IV or a Panther or a Tiger. Of course, you just have to stay attentive and watch out for the fighter bombers. and you see a wooded area, and that's where a German tank may hide from the fighter bombers or emerge once an Allied artillery strike or bombardment program indicates the beginning of some kind of operation. And they receive the radio message, Achtung, Panzermarsch, and out they come. And, they're rolling right into the counterattack against either Canadian or British infantry or British tanks that are edging along slowly but surely to try to not be in any sort of disadvantage when that, Panzer IV fire or Panther tank fire comes in.
Brilliant stuff. So that's that introduction video there. Now we're going to just go through these 5 battles one by one. So July the 25th up to August. So Operation Spring to start off with. So over to you, Arthur. And we've got these maps with your hand-drawn notations in which the units we're talking about. So sort of set the scene for July the 25th.
So as the part of Phase 1 of Operation Spring, Lieutenant General Simmons, the 2nd Canadian Corps commander, had determined that several villages within the path of the 2nd Canadian Corps had to fall. And of course, Spring, not many people know it. There's actually 4 very distinct phases planned after the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions, supported by the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, had fought their way forward. Then waiting in the wings was the entire British 7th Armored Division, the entire Guards Armored Division, a huge amount of force. But like many operations, the objectives had to fall in sequential order. And if somehow one of those objectives, those dominoes, did not fall, it created a heck of a problem as all the other phases and units began to stack up behind the area where the Germans had managed to resist. So Simmons is very much influenced by Operation Goodwood, which he observed some parts of it on 18th and 19th July. And he saw the British tank attack go in, and several, dozen British tanks were knocked out, burning wrecks. And he infamously said to his brigadier, chief of staff, he looked at him, he said, "When it's my turn," he, of course, Simmons with a British accent, "when it's my turn, we'll do this at night." And, he walks off to the command car, and he plans to do this infantry assaults at night, aided by the anti-aircraft searchlights that will be reflected off the low-flying cloud, and provide some light for the infantry platoon and company commanders to go forth. And one of these infantry brigades of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division has to clear the Tilly-la-Campagne, then La Hogue, and then Secville-la-Campagne, Garcelles. Then further follow-on forces from the British will charge down the highway, the Route Nationale 158, pushing towards Longuichon and clearing the wooded areas around Garcelles, Secville-la-Campagne, and eventually, hopefully, gain some breathing room for armored maneuver to push right through to, hopefully, Falaise or the surrounding area. But it's all depending on things going correctly for the lead assault battalion for the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, attacking right out of Bourguébus Village. Behind them is the North Shore Regiment. It's not mentioned on the map there. And in the reserve battalion, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders under Lieutenant Colonel Christensen. They're in the area of Solières just behind. Defending Tilly-la-Campagne is the front line of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler with the 3rd Panzer, 2nd Panzer, the SS Panzer Grenadier-Regiment 2, which is the half-track mounted battalion. Of course, it's left majority of its half-tracks behind, and supporting it is the Panzer IVs of the 7th Company of the Panzer Regiment. There's other forces beside to the left and to the right, but we're just focusing on this particular battle. And so at 0300, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders set out with 2 companies up front, 1 company in reserve, and another company which will go around to the right. And the D company manages to fight its way right into Tilly, but it starts to bog down, and it fights its way through a series of trenches right to the north of Tilly-la-Campagne. But for the sheer number, 850 people in a battalion, but of course only 450 in the actual line companies, 400-ish, 120 to a company. So we're looking at 480 there. So, but that's at full strength. But these companies start chewing their way through the German defenses. Of course, the German tanks open up on them, as well as some of the half tracks with the 75 millimeter short-barreled Panzer IV cannon from, say, 1940 French campaign. They have those as well within the Tilly-la-Campagne, as well as a company of the Sturmgeschütz self-propelled guns. So it's not an insignificant armored force. And unlike the Canadians, the Germans fight with their armor at night intensively, and they have no compunctions about not doing it. So as the infantrymen are desperately trying to take on these tanks, tremendous losses are inflicted on the North Nova Scotia Highlander companies. And so the battle is hanging in the balance as it goes on and on from 3 o'clock in the morning all the way to just the dawn of break of day. And of course, the Germans saw them coming. There's a tremendous amount of knocked out British tanks left over from the Bourguébus fighting Operation Goodwood, and that's where their OPs are. So the Germans very much detect them as they're coming on the way. And this battalion, the SPV, half-track battalion, is an elite battalion within the Leibstandarte, as much of the resources are dumped into it as far as officers and equipment. So yes, we can go to the next slide there. So things are hanging in the balance. Lieutenant Colonel Petch, the commanding officer of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, sends in, there he is right there in the center, he desperately sends in the Fort Garry Horse Squadron assigned for the phase 2 of spring to resolve the situation in Tilly, which he understands is starting to go badly. He also dispatches the carrier platoon of the support company, and in a very determined fashion, the Fort Garry Horse Squadron B Squadron under Major Christensen, as well as the carrier platoon, they attack from the east right out of the sun as the day is breaking on Tilly in this massive tank battle. And despite this, one of the most determined Canadian armored attacks of the war that no student of Canadian military history, a lot of them do not know about it. It's driven back with terrible, terrible losses, but several of the carriers managed to fight their right way into Tilly. Of course, this is the Germans are fighting very hard here, and you see here, this is what happens on the 25th of July. The Germans are ready for another Goodwood, and they counterattack intensively with the 9th SS Panzer Division, with another battle group from the 9th SS Panzer Division, with Camp Group Starts, which destroys the Black Watch. Parts of the 272nd Infantry Division are fighting at May, and they're desperately trying to hold the Canadians back. And unlike other parts of the German front in Normandy, they have the resources to actually do it, to actually be a peer enemy, a peer force to the Canadian Army and the British. So the only area for definite success is around VerrieRes, which is another presentation, another TV show on World War II TV for another time. But the British Army there, the parts of the 22nd Armored Brigade and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Royal Regiment of Canada prevail. But over to the right, on Tilly with the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, things are going very, very badly. And after the terribly one-sided tank battle that just annihilates the Fort Garry Horse B Squadron and shoots up a lot of the carriers that managed to penetrate into Tilly, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders begin to fall back. And just at this time, very, very dramatically, a huge Nebelwerfer, it's the rocket launchers for the Germans from SS Werfer Abteilung 1, fire a huge barrage, which just launches the huge series of explosions just north of Tilly, where when the Germans, they record, when the smoke clears after the fire and smoke is sent hundreds of feet into the air, all that's left, when the smoke clears is just the burnt out Canadian tanks. There's North Nova Scotia Highlanders. What's left of them is fighting still in the village. But then again, at this time, the resistance begins to collapse, and about 40 North Nova Scotia Highlanders are taken prisoner in the village. And as they pull back, there's also a drama going on in the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade. It's in the headquarters of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. And this is something a lot of people don't know about. The brigade commander, Cunningham, was determined to push through more force to prevail and carry the day at Tilly. And the battalion he had earmarked for this, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders under Lieutenant Colonel Christensen. There's a huge verbal battle that takes place from 12 noon all the way till 4 o'clock in the afternoon between Petch and Christensen on one side fighting with Cunningham. And it goes back and forth, and they fight verbally that they cannot throw good money after bad. It's a lost cause and just lead to further annihilation, and you'll annihilate the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders. But I have to tell the truth here and give the proper assessment. Cunningham was giving a lawful command. The Stormont Dungas and Glengarry Highlanders was an extremely powerful, up-to-strength infantry battalion, though exhausted somewhat. In the aftermath of this, Keller, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division commander, with Simmons, sees Cunningham removed, Petch removed, Christensen removed, all for a supposed lack of drive. And Keller was giving lawful orders. You cannot, when the order is given to attack, you have to attack. And the truth is, during many of these hours, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders were hanging on by a thread. And we'll never know, was victory snatched from the Canadian Army by this lack of drive, this lack of desire, and lack of resources. And there's huge resources there. The entire British 7th Armored Division is there. The Guards Armored Division is there. More squadrons of the Fort Garry Horse is there. And this penny packeting, this small, one battalion will either win or lose the fight. And it's very, very tragic. It's a very, very sad story.
And how much of this, Arthur, is just, I'm being devil's advocate here. The 9th Brigade have been at it since D-Day. So this is sort of 7 weeks into a campaign. So, okay, they haven't been in the absolute thick of it every single day, but they've been in the thick of it a lot of that. So how much of this can you just put down to weariness, fatigue, stress of the job? It's not necessarily saying, people, as soon as people start saying refusing orders, words get bandied about like cowardice and things like that. And what's your assessment of, you were a serving Canadian officer. What's your assessment of how it is to be in combat continually for 7 weeks?
Yes, they had been mortared continuously, been on the front lines for not one bit of a break. The morale within the Stormont, the SDGH, was tremendously low. They wanted out of the front line due to their battle exhaustion. This battle put in at night, fighting at night, of course, it negates the ability of the tanks to properly support this attack. It negates the ability of the fighter bombers to properly support this attack. Rather than an all-out bombardment or a rolling bombardment, a creeping barrage, it's only several concentrations are delivered by the Royal Artillery and Royal Canadian Artillery. And of course, Petch had seen this carnage going on all morning, and he was convinced, as was Christensen, that the SDGH would be annihilated. So Cunningham supports them, and he goes up against Keller. And of course, it's a very different, it's a difficult question. Of course, you've seen the North Nova Scotia Highlanders had, however, already made this tremendous sacrifice. And to have this many men killed and wounded and taken prisoner and achieve nothing from it, it's a tremendously difficult situation to judge as a historian. So you see both sides of it.
You just have to be nuanced. You just, as we always say on this channel, you have to look at these things objectively and just try and place yourself in that environment and not be too judgmental, because, I've not been facing German armor for 7 weeks, and what would that do to my mental health? And I think it's a good point to bring up the Germans this point, because as volume 1 of your two book studies, that the Germans have had. I mean, Goodwood. We still debate Goodwood. Is it a draw? Is it a defeat? Is it defeat? It is. Of course, it attrits the Germans considerably, but they've come out of that feeling pretty damn good in the sense that they have held off an attack. They've mounted some counterattacks. So, how would you describe the morale of people like the Germans you've got on screen now?
Yes, there's Diefenthal. He's the commander of the 3rd Battalion of SS Grenadier-Regiment 2, which is defending Tilly with attached forces. There's a shot of him as a war criminal at the Ardennes Malmedy massacre trial. But their morale is very high. And during the battle, they're screaming, they're yelling fanatically, "Surrender, Canada, surrender." And they're machine gunning the living daylights out of them. And they have all these heavy weapons, these Panzer IVs, these half-tracks with 75 millimeter guns on them, all the heavy weapons of the SPV battalion, which is tremendously well equipped. And they're fighting as defenders, and they're inflicting tremendous losses. And there's Werner Wolf, various, used as a propaganda object after some of these defensive victories at Tilly. You see him there with the battlefield PK propaganda company reporter taking down his recording for German radio. But of course, these are all veterans of the Eastern Front, and they're very confident. British and Canadian tanks, not a problem. Canadian infantry and British infantry, not a problem. They were scared of the fighter bombers and absolutely given terrible time of it by the Royal Artillery and Royal Canadian Artillery, as well as naval gunfire in Normandy, as well as the supplies to carry on this artillery war. But when given the chance, and this Werner Wolf, is a committed Nazi National Socialist of the Waffen-SS, leading the 7th Panzer Company, protege of Josen Piper, if you know that name. And of course, he's an infantry officer, and many of these infantry officers suddenly become themselves, surprise, surprise, Panzer Company or Panzer Platoon officers, and they, without any serious training, and they're suddenly commanding a company or a troop of tanks. It's a little bit bizarre, but he does a very good job of it and leads the 7th Company in determined, almost very much fanatical resistance in Tilly.
Now, and it's interesting again to talk about the fact that we know, those of us that have studied the Normandy campaign, that we know that the trajectory is going the Allied way. As we go through June and July, we're in the attrition period. We're getting towards breakout is on the horizon. It's not quite there yet, but Cobra, things like that, Blue Coat are on the horizon. But yet, if you look at this battle as an example, it doesn't really convey that sense that the Allies are gaining an upper hand, because this is sort of going against the general routine. But I think before we talk about July the 31st, I think it'd be a good time to play the little video of Bugaboo, because while this battlefield is going on, and 5 battles for Tilly, we're talking about almost total destruction of these villages. We'll have clips at the end, folks, of what was left. Pretty much nothing of Tilly at the end of the campaign. I'll show footage of what it's like, well, basically last week. But if I show you the footage of Bugaboo, the little village centre there, it'll give you an idea, folks, of just how much destruction occurred in this area. I mean, we're talking an area that's firmly within a commuter belt for Caen now, so it's doing quite well. But we'll play this, and if you want to mention anything out about Bug, because Bugaboo is kind of a start line for most of these attacks, isn't it?
Yes, it's very much a Canadian stronghold at this time, but what during Goodwood was a German stronghold, so very much destroyed by the Royal Artillery, as well as fighter bomber airstrikes. These are, of course, all new post-1945 buildings, all the streets rebuilt, everything redesigned, all very modern now. But at the time, some buildings did survive, because they're all these Norman stone farmers' buildings with walls around them. Of course, a lot of this has disappeared, in the France of 2023. But yes, you see the large, those are agricultural buildings in the background, I believe. If I'm not wrong, I'm not there in France.
And and people like Rob, the history explorer, watching right now. Brad is going to be from Canadian Electricity, is going to be over here next April. Is that people like ourselves, we go there and we study the battles. We look at, that's where the tanks went, that's where the artillery was. But of course, there's a civilian loss of life as well. Now, these villages aren't massive, so we're not talking about huge numbers of people. This village had, there's 3 names on there as victims, yes, of the war. But you're talking about a village that a lot of these people, we talked about it earlier with Denis earlier in the week. They've been evacuated to the quarries south of Caen. These villages, there's been fighting on their doorstep now for a best part of a month, and there's bullet holes spang there on the. Colin found that. Colin's watching. That was you who found that, wasn't it, Colin? We were wandering across there. And an interesting skull and crossbones that totally nothing to do with World War II that Colin wanted me to video, which I did. So there you are, Colin. So that was July the 25th. It couldn't really have gone worse. It's fair to say. Let's do July the 31st, and don't forget we've got the footage of Hubert Folly and anything. When you want me to play that, Arthur, just say the word. But let's talk about a few days later.
Yes, you're probably wondering, well, why is this attack happening? Something to the west had occurred, something wonderful for the U.S. First Army. Cobra has struck. And of course, it succeeded and succeeded and succeeded in the 4th and 5th days. And suddenly the British realize that they have to attack as well to support Cobra, to stop these panzer divisions from racing away from VerrieRes Ridge and Bourguébus Ridge, to stop the Americans. And this becomes Operation Blue Coat. but still left there after the 9th SS Panzer Division departs. The Leibstandarte is still defending the area, of course, with a brand new fresh battalion in Tilly. But the pressure comes down. Of course, everything flows downhill. And the Canadians of the 2nd Canadian Corps of Lieutenant General Simmons are directed to keep up the pressure, maintain the prods forward on the Germans, keep them occupied, stop these Panzer divisions and Panzer units and Panzer Grenadier divisions from all going west to fight the Americans and the British. So the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Megel, he becomes a major general, and he is a very successful in some later operations in the war. He is very successful, but he also is there leading the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade during some of the most disastrous infantry attacks ever put in by the Canadian Army. A huge number of people are killed and wounded under his command, and that, well, you know, he has to be looked in with a balanced view. Often he was almost the victim of Simmons' planning. He was given no chance to plan operations and micromanage to an nth degree, and he was reduced to saying, well, just get on with it, get going. But we see another one of these attacks put in by the Calgary Highlanders, which took heavy casualties during Operation Spring. They've been rebuilt, and the Essex Scottish managed to capture that most left-hand circle on the route National 158, the farm with a reservoir in it, and the Calgary Highlanders under Lieutenant Colonel McLaughlin build that as their firm base. He builds a bunker there, a command bunker. The rest of the battalion has to march almost all the way from the surroundings of May, to all the way to the east to put in this attack on Tilly-la-Campagne in the early hours of the 1st of August. The Lincoln and Welland Regiment from the newly arrived 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade makes a feint attack with the Germans, which they get heavily machine gunned, and they're driven back near the railway line to the top. But by this time, 0300, it's H hour, and walking right down the road in the middle of the night, it's another night attack.
Well, let's play the video footage. So
Yes.
this is of the farm, and the reservoir that Arthur just mentioned is kind of surrounded by a fence now. But I'll play that film there, and then Arthur carry on the story. And we ended up going to this, I think, 3 times, didn't we, Colin? Because we were going back and forth and realizing just how compact this battlefield was. We were kind of there for one reason, then you go off and drive by and going back for it for a second reason. But here's the bit we're talking about there. So back to you, Arthur.
Yes, and you see this is where the Calgary Highlanders marched through. Of course, the wheat being almost chest high, they're centering along. They're leaving this. This is just before their start line, where McLaughlin had his bunker near the reservoir. Of course, the reservoir is just behind this hedge. The Germans were using that for drinking water, so it was a bit of a blow for when the Essex captured it. Of course, this is right, all the infantry companies passed around this farm as they pushed right into Tilly. And of course, they came across the railway line, the chemin fer de minier, which was the mining railway line for the iron ore, which some parts of it raised, some parts of it were level, but the Germans used it sort of as a defensive obstacle. And of course, there we're looking straight at Tilly, so they had to push through these fields in the middle of the night. Of course, you'd see the start of the green tracer from the MG-42s, the German machine guns, starting to lance right through the fields. And there's the farmer's track. It's still there today. And there's Tilly. And of course, they're attacking 2 companies up, 2 companies back. And of course, it's dark. It's the middle of the night. There's no Allied tanks with them. Of course, all the German tank commanders, they're almost living like rats. The crews of the German tanks that are still within Tilly, they're hiding underneath the tanks. They're using the tanks almost as a bunker from the shell fire. And the German infantry is starting to dig in away from Tilly to get away from it, because now Tilly, due to the Royal Artillery, Royal Canadian Artillery, the fighter bombers, it's a death trap. And the cellars, sometimes they have 2 flights of stairs in some of these farmers' houses. They're very much bunkers now for the Germans, this Waffen-SS of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. So the Calgary Highlanders advance, and they finally get to the railway line, which is just in front of them. And The Germans let them get close in some fashion. They let them get close and go over the top of the railway line, and they become silhouetted as the flares are going off, and there's some explosions from artillery fire. And just as the Calgary Highlanders are over this railway line, the Germans open up on them with everything they have: the tank fire, the MG-42s, mortars, artillery and defensive fire, missions on pre-registered targets. And the Calgary advance attack bogs down, and they're driven back, but they dig in on the opposite side of the railway line, which is raised in some portions. In some places it's level, but the Germans are using that as their kill zone. Of course, there's no Canadian tanks, and they finally, daylight comes, and the Calgary Highlanders, they reorganized, and the Scots Greys, the famous British armored regiment, the famous cavalry regiment, shows up with part of a squadron, and they attempt to attack over the railway line again. Several Scots Greys tanks are knocked out, and the Calgary Highlanders are driven back. This is not through lack of determination. Some of the Calgary Highlanders climbing onto the Panzer IVs and attempting to destroy them with piets and grenades. It's a very desperate fight. They're withdrawn back again. And McLaughlin, the lieutenant colonel, the company commanders are summoned back. They're summoned back to his bunker at the farm with the reservoir. And he says, "You'll go in again. You're going to attack again." And they go back, and they have a company from the Royal Regiment of Canada to supplement them, and a fresh troop of tanks from the Fort Garry Horse. But it's another terrible slaughter as they just can't get past that railway line. And the Germans, at the same time, in the middle of the night, guess what drove out of La Hogue? Basically every Panzer IV that was there and running. They drive right through the fields in the middle of the night. So as the Calgary Highlanders are getting shot up for the first time in the middle of the night, and they're getting stopped on this railway line of death, the Panzer IVs will line up almost in lines, and the Canadian soldiers that survived the attack say they were facing groups of 5 German tanks at once, and there's no Canadian, there's no Allied tanks there due to this doctrine of no fighting at night, or very rarely. That'll change on the 8th of August in Operation Totalize. But it's another and it goes on all day long. It just goes on and on, right from the middle of the night, right almost into the afternoon, when McLaughlin finally says enough and he pulls them back. But it's a very desperate battle that's not pursued for lack of determination by the Calgary Highlanders. Another infamous battle.
Well, let's play the video that's showing the area kind of where the Panzer IVs came from, because one of the things I was telling you when we had our chat earlier with Colin is that it is more or less flat, but from the Sackville-La Hogue area where the Panzer IVs came from, I'll go back to the map, to put the map there for a second, exactly where it says, well, just below where it says Panzer IVs there's kind of, you're dropping down a slight reverse slope there. So I'm imagining that when the Calgary Highlanders were just at their very worst point coming in from the west there, these Panzer IVs would have been able to get quite close to them before they're able to be seen. Yet the Germans would have known exactly where the Canadians were because of their prior knowledge. But I'll play that video now. And again, folks, you seem to be appreciating the video footage, and it was, I have to say, me and Colin had a nice day out, nice lunch, a beer at lunchtime, and a cake in the afternoon. It was good. But so here's this area of the battlefield again. So take us through the Panzer IV. I know you've just said it, but kind of remind us what they're trying to achieve and what the German situation was like.
Yes, it's alarm, Achtung, Achtung. Panzer, the flare goes up. It's a signal, the prearranged signal. The Panzer IVs start up. The crews scrabble out from underneath them into the vehicle, in through the hatches. Hatches closed. Panzer march. The drivers get off. They're going right through the fields, right in the middle of the night. Of course, there's only, very limited visibility, but this huge battle and the machine gun fire lights up. Everybody knows where Tilly is. They know where they're going. The Panzer commanders, they're familiar with the area by now. They race across the fields. And just as the Calgary Highlanders are trying to enter the village, guess who shows up and takes their place among other Panzer IVs that are already in Tilly? Of course, Tilly's a death trap now, and all the panzers are getting very small damage, but enough to pull them out of action by the continuous Canadian RCA artillery fire, the Royal Canadian Artillery. And of course, the Royal Canadian Artillery, this is revenge. They are going to annihilate Tilly right off the face of the earth. There is just absolutely nothing that's going to be left of it. They have the whole 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, 4th Canadian Armored Division, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division artillery at their fingertips to carry out this destruction of Tilly. And slowly but surely, Tilly is obliterated from the face of the earth.
And that footage there, again, you can see there are these little drops. So we're now a bit further north, and there's Bugaboo, and then Tilly in the background there, and the repaired church spire that I showed you a few minutes ago with the video clip there. So
there's a little dip in front of Bourguébus, and in front of there's a giant wrecked area of British tanks from the previous battle that the Germans would inhabit at night as part of their patrolling program. And also to the left, there's point 63, which is used, by the infantry and armored commanders on the Canadian side as sort of a, you take this point and you will use it as a strong base, and the armor will shoot in the infantry if they're having any trouble. But you can see it's not really much of a hill at all. It's very, it must have been very, very confusing for the tank commanders at the break of dawn.
Yeah, no, definitely. We've got a few seconds of that to play, and then I'll put the map up again there. So, we're getting a sense already that this is fraught would be an understatement to talk about this battle there. It's taking place at night, which when things start going badly, things can go very badly wrong because you simply just don't know where the people are, and if the enemy are taking advantage, it can rapidly unravel. So July the 31st is going hardly better than July the 25th, and I'll bring the map up there. But hopefully this footage is really conveying some of that topography around the area there and just what it's like today. Because we had a question earlier, is the battlefield like it was? And the answer is pretty much yes. The villages have been replaced and expanded slightly. As you go further north towards Caen, it is a little bit more modernized, but basically it's pretty much as it was. So I'll bring the map up there for you to summarize 31st, then we'll take it up to August.
Yes, so eventually by mid-afternoon, McLaughlin communicates with Megill, and of course Megill's prodding him on, and he eventually pulls back what's remained of the Calgary Highlanders companies, which are they survive to a greater degree than the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. They take heavy casualties and they push right into Tilly-Campagne, but they are forced over and they manage to withdraw back to the farm with the reservoir. As well as the Royal Regiment of Canada out of Toronto. One of their companies has taken part as well, but they can't get over the railway line either. So you have this lineup of Panzer IVs that are just blasting everything that raises its head over the top of the railway line. Yes, and of course the NATO armies today. This is a shot. I should identify this. This is from the North Nova Scotia Highlander battle on the 25th of July when they desperately were attacking B Squadron. This is a B Squadron tank, and a troop of Panzer IVs loop around them, come up behind them, and annihilate this troop of Shermans. And as part of the battle, that B Squadron eventually loses. But there are losses to the Panzer IVs as well. There's a Panzer IV right now. The armor is no better than the Sherman. Of course, if they get hit, they'd be penetrated and they'd have to bail out. But the gun is better. It's a high velocity 75 millimeter L48, which is a lot better than the Sherman. So this is the technological apogee of the development of the Panzer IV, which was still very effective against Canadian infantry during Operation Atlantic, Operation Spring, and the later battles around Tilly-la-Campagne, where the 7th Panzer Company fights with its Panzer IVs, often in dug-in almost tank foxholes that have been excavated. So part of the tank is hidden from view, apart from the turret and the commander and the gunner.
And we've got that photo of some 9th Infantry Division guys there. And I'm going to bring up David Keefe's comment, which is where he says, terrain like that gives you a great indication how important reconnaissance is before any attack. It all appears to be flat, but there could be plenty of dead ground area that can be useful. And that's exactly what Colin and I experienced last week, is our first little pootle around the battlefield there, it's all flat. Then when you actually start driving across the tracks and stopping, you realize there are these depressions and then slightly elevated bits. And from one bit, you can see everything. And the next bit, 100 yards down the road, you can see nothing. And it's only by pretty much walking that ground. And I mean, so at this time of the campaign, there should have been, you know, patrols and before these attacks to try and identify that. But I'm assuming it was the Germans who knew the area better than the Allies did in most cases. But we're moving into August. So 2 attacks down, 3 more to go.
Yes.
So people are loving this, Arthur. So let's recap August the 1st.
Yes, more prodding is demanded of the newly arrived 4th Canadian Armored Division, the 10th Canadian Armored Brigade under, I'm drawing a brain freeze here for the 10th or 10th Infantry Brigade Commander Jefferson he is, Brigadier Jefferson. And of course, he deems this to be nothing but a 1 battalion or 1 company objective. It's just a village, right? And the Lincoln and Welland Regiment is sent in to attack, and this will be yet another night attack. And the South Alberta Regiment, the Armored Recce Regiment for the division, the 4th Canadian Armored Division, is sent to seize Point 63 just to the northwest of Tilly. Of course, there's a brand new German battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment 1, but the Panzer IVs, some of them are still there, but the majority of them are, you know, really located to La Hogue at this time, or to the south. As a diversionary measure and to stop the Panzers, something bizarre happens. The A and B companies of the Lincolns are weighed down with shovels and pickaxes and everything that would make noise in the middle of the night, and they're sent off to be a blocking force between La Hogue and Tilly, to cut off the Germans racing from La Hogue to help the defenders of Tilly. 1 company is sent off to attack Tilly right down the main road. It's not imaginative at all. And D company is sent to form a firm base. And you see the lack of experience of the Lincolns. This is their first battlefield experience. This is their first real attack. And there's not really a huge participation of Panzer IVs in this defensive actions. It's mainly the MG-42 gunners. They badly shoot up A and B companies. And C company, when it finally gets to Tilly, is badly shot up by the green tracers and the MG-42s firing on fixed axes, which means they stake in a machine gun right there. They stake it in, and they just keep firing off a burst every, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, another burst. And the idea being, if anything crosses that line of fire, you'll eat some 7.92 bullets. And so the SAR, the South Alberta Regiment Squadron, that's on Point 63 when day breaks, and the C Company is having a terrible, terrible time of it. The infantry of the Lincoln, an officer runs up to them and yells at them, and they attempt to push forward a little bit, the SAR Squadron, but they're driven back by anti-tank fire from Tilly. Eventually, the losses of A and B companies, the C Company is just, they can't get through the machine gun fire. D Company is badly shot up at the railway line. They're all pulled back to Bourguébus, and the attack collapses, and the Germans are unfortunately still the masters of Tilly. And they're more confident than ever, but the Germans are taking more and more losses now. You see the battalions are rotating out. The German tank units are rotating out because the artillery fire is never ending.
Mm-hmm. Let's play the video of the area between Hubert-Fully and Bugaboo, because it shows the railway lines. Because me and Colin had a bit of trouble kind of working it out, because there's like a main line and there's little spurs, because as you said earlier, it's the mining area. But it'll give people an idea of the terrain there. So this, the captions are on it there. So this is the area where the Lincolns came through, and it is pretty much as it was there, just that there's no railway lines on the embankments anymore. It's now it's further up. It's the one branch of this is the same railway line we talked about last time, Arthur, with 3rd RTR hitting the underpass under the railway line. There, it's the same railway line. But this is that area there they came through. And again, you don't need me to tell you folks, apart from the railway embankment, it is flat. But you can see here, for example, where when you do get a few feet higher, because I'm about 8 foot up above there, how you suddenly get that much better views. And I'm now looking towards Bugaboo there, and then Tilly-la-Campagne is beyond that. So I'll let that play. And if you want to add any more details about that for August 1st battle, then if not, we'll move on. But I'll hand it over to you to add some extra information, Arthur.
Yes, of course, the darkness would have minimized the effect, but the minute you get on top of this high feature, you are silhouetted. And if you have to cross back over it, that's another opportunity for the German machine gunners to observe movement. You can't hide. You can hide in the wheat, but when you're scrabbling around on this railway line that's inconveniently placed there, you can hide behind it if you want to travel north-south, but eventually the Germans do use parts of it as for machine gun pits and outposts, combat outposts, listening posts, etc., etc. Of course, the Germans don't have any ultra intelligence. They don't have any aerial recce. They basically, it's what they can capture in the way of prisoners, and with the scavenge in the way of tanks for maps, as well as radio code books, as well as simply observing the enemy and what their movements are, and the intensity of their artillery programs. That's the best guess that some of these German units have about what is exactly the Canadians are going to do or what the British are going to do. They're tremendously in the dark compared to the Allies that have all these intelligence advantages. But yes, it's very much open country, excellent for a machine gunner, excellent for a tank commander, if you're, of course, on the defending side. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to add on that.
No, it's great to have that footage there, and it takes me back to those, as some of you were saying in the sidebar, the early days of World War II TV, when I was sending Mag and Colin and Duncan out doing footage. But they're all, well, Duncan doesn't live in France anymore, but Colin and Mag, they're busy working all the time now. Although Mag says she would like to do another live one of these shows at some point. But this system works quite well, where I've got the footage in the can the week before, so there's no worry about Wi-Fi dropping out or the rain coming in. So it sets a scene. But We'll go back to the map, and then you've got a couple more images to show. So that was the 1st and 2nd of August. Tell us about these photos here, Arthur.
Yes, that's how a Canadian infantry section looked. Of course, with the corporal heading them up, and yes, no body armor.
Oh, sorry.
And if no body armor. No squad machine gun that is built fed. The Bren was a fine weapon, very fine weapon, but of course it only had the 30, the magazine. When you're done with that magazine, it's not like you're feeding belt after belt into it. So for the firefights, etc., you say things had moved on from World War I, but in some ways they hadn't. And of course these were men. They're terribly susceptible to any sort of splinter artillery fire, artillery shrapnel, machine gun bullets, just battle exhaustion, complete mental breakdown after seeing many of their friends die. And so yes, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders, they've seen a steady trickle of casualties, this among other Canadian units that have been in action since D-Day, since the 6th of June. And now we're into late July. So you're seeing total exhaustion. And this is, of course, wounded men. The stretcher bearers are there. They perform their hugely important battlefield duty of actually getting the wounded men onto the stretcher and getting them off the battlefield, all of a sudden being shot at by German machine gunners, etc., and to get back where they can get some kind of shelter from the fire. And then possibly a universal carrier would come forward and they can load the wounded into there, or a Jeep to move back to the clearing station, or where the ambulances were, where some basic triage can be set up about who needs the most urgent medical care. But this is the true cost to the Canadian Army. This picture says it all. The Canadian Infantry Corps, without a doubt, bore the brunt of the loss of life and wounds and mental and physical trauma that was the modern warfare of 1944. And
thank you, Arthur. And by this point, August the 5th, obviously there's still a need to take this footage. There's still a need to push out. The breakout is going very well over to the west. The Middleton's 8th Corps is well on its way to Avranches, etc. But this village now, what has it now become? Just almost a psychological thing that they must just get it to put to bed the memories of these 3 attacks. There's a element of almost revenge coming in now. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and there's also the mistaken belief that the Germans are pulling out, and there's Montgomery shows up at Simmons headquarters, or he gives them the message, written message or radio message. "Oh, I see you've been thrown out of Tilly again," and this tremendously caustic remark thrown right into Simmons' face. And of course, they must keep up the pressure. They must keep up the pressure at all costs. And these intelligence reports are coming out that the Leibstandarte is leaving. They're finally leaving. And of course, they are. They leave the next day for Operation Lettich, but they haven't left yet, much to the dismay of the Black Watch and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of the 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade. So this is on all 4th Canadian Armored Division operation. They believe everybody is leaving from La Hogue and they're leaving from Tilly-Campagne. So the SAR again are dispatched to provide armored support, and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders attack with 2 companies instead of the full battalion, instead of like 2 battalions, instead of a full armored battalion. As the terrible 1940 Battle of France phase penny packeting. This is something that the Canadian Army the Canadian Armored Corps falls victim to during the Second World War at times. And the German machine gunners, they fight a desperate battle against the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders that attack Tilly. And there's the famous story, not really known within Canadian military history, of there's almost one man who sits in the wheat and beats back a large portion of the C and D company of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders infantry attack on Tilly. He's part of an infantry position, and he's the MG-42 gunner. He's SS Panzer Grenadier Ernst Gostel. During the infantry combat, there he is right there. He's the only Panzer Grenadier, the enlisted man, not an officer, not a senior NCO, to be awarded the Knight's Cross during the entire Second World War within the Waffen-SS. And he does this by fighting the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. He's eventually, grenade or rifle fire blinds him in one eye. He continues to fire the machine gun. Later, Bren gunfire it blinds him fully. And, due to the story or the way he tells it, he continues firing the MG-42, and everybody around him is dead until finally the Argyll and Sutherland attack, shoots the machine gun right out of his hands, and he's, left unconscious. A German counterattack eventually pushes through as the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders are forced to withdraw, and they drag him back. And blinded, he receives the Knight Cross. He can't even, of course, see who's giving it to him. But it's terrible. It shows the determination of some of these Waffen-SS officers for this lost cause of Nazism, and the determination to fight, and the fanaticism that had been to an arguable degree instilled within them, and that he's willing to continue fighting against this 240-man attack of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders that is pushing all the way around him, and he continues to fight. But it is arguably because of his action in this field north of Tilly, beside the Maisy farm, that the Argylls are beaten back and forced to withdraw. Of course, the anti-tank gunners from Tilly managed to knock out some of the SAR tanks, the South Alberta Regiment, and eventually the Argylls under Lieutenant Colonel Dave Stewart, he orders the pullback. And so for the 4th time, Tilly has not fallen. This infamous village that is basically nothing but a hole in the ground now, a few bricks, just rough tracks. It's just devastation. It's the moon. And of course, these are the infantrymen that are bearing the brunt of this combat. The inexperienced regiments are getting almost rotated through the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. This is their first battle. And to the right, the Canadian Grenadier Guards, supported by the Canadian Grenadier Guards. If you just want to go back to the map for 1 second there.
Oops, there we go.
The Lake Superior Regiment. They think La Hogue is abandoned. They push in. They're ambushed. The Canadian Grenadier Guards, the tanks save the infantry. They have to fire with everything they've got. And the SAR commander, the South Alberta Regiment, he's entirely disgusted after this day's fighting. He's just appalled. And he just lambasts Brigadier Jefferson. He says this should have been a brigade operation with a full armored 2 armored battalions, a multi-infantry brigade operation to push forward and seize these villages, which holding them could have possibly aided Operation Totalize in the future. And Witherspoon, he just castigates Jefferson, and he says, he had a brigade. He had a brigade, which is, and of course, some of these brigadiers, this is their first action in Normandy. They may have fought in other areas, but Italy was an entirely different battleground and an entirely different set of tactical challenges.
And people have been asking about artillery, where's the artillery support? So you've got a photo of a 25 pounder. So perhaps it'll be now a good time to talk about artillery.
Yes, the timed concentration was, was the favorite weapon of the RCA field artillery regiments. Of course, there are 3 in every infantry division, and 2 25 pounder field artillery regiments within the armored divisions. And of course, dumped on top of this is all the corps level artillery, the medium, and of course the super heavy, as well as the fighter bombers, which were constantly orbiting overhead. And of course, the response to any German victory was an hours-long barrage. And you see a lot of the German infantry attempting to get out of Tilly because it's just never ending. And of course, the sophisticated fire programs of the RCA and Royal Artillery, the Germans were convinced at the end of the Normandy campaign that they had a semi-automatic 25 pounder, that it wasn't human beings loading the shells, but the 25 pounders and the priests were firing so rapidly and so effectively that it had to be some revolutionary new weapon. But it was, of course, this was the cream of the British Army, and arguably the best officers and men within the Canadian Army in the Royal Canadian Artillery and the Royal Artillery. And of course, Simmons, an artillery officer, Montgomery, an artillery officer, they just constantly had the artillery mindset. And thus, the artillery took a huge role. But sometimes as these infantry battalions were mixed up in Tilly and almost on top of the Germans, the RCA was forced to stop firing due to the desire, or the desire not to kill their own men.
I've just put the video up, just showing the area kind of around Tilly-la-Campagne. So this is the north and west. So this is kind of summing up the battlefield that we've talked about for 4 battles so far. We've got one to go, the final one. And it's, I feel that we're just repeating ourselves a bit with this footage, but it's good to just get a sense of it. So me and Colin did it last week, and these are the same fields where you just talked about that incredible MG42 action. It's around here somewhere. The same action, the location the Calgary Highlanders have been for a few days there, and now it's this another infantry attack. So yeah, that's the same track that goes up to where the farm was with the reservoir, and you can see the ground rising up there to Verrieres Ridge back there in the distance. So that's back over to point 67. David O'Keefe is in the sidebar, of course, wrote about the Blackwatch Cadre over there. Point 67 Mesa, or we've done that on previous shows there. But we're going to be bringing things to the final battle soon. But anything else you want to kind of tell us about the actual, while we've got the video playing, anything about the terrain that you think needs to be conveyed, Arthur?
No, the Germans very much saw this as the tank country. This is the area to win or lose the armored battle that would defeat another Goodwood, defeat a drive to Falaise. But of course, much to the embarrassment of General de Panzertruppen Eberbach, the commander of Panzer Group West, the battle is to the west with Cobra, with Blue Coat, and all these wonderful resources that they've allocated. They've got to rip it all apart and abandon the battlefield, leaving, Kurt Meyer in the 12th SS Panzer Division and the 89th Infantry Division, which relieves the Leibstandarte to defend this area with much reduced resources. And of course, as the Germans become weaker and weaker, the British Second Army and what becomes the First Canadian Army becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, and a massive operation is planned. Of course, they look at this and they decide, just like Ken Tout, and you see his book here, the Battle of Tilly.
Fantastic book, yeah.
Fantastic book, and he also wrote A Fine Night for Tanks. And of course, Simmons decides it is a fine night for tanks. And a massive series of armored phalanxes are arranged to assault through the night to literally drive past and through and beyond the Germans to get where they need to go to break out of Bourguébus Ridge, to break out of VerrieRes Ridge, and to use this excellent tank country for what it is, for an armored assault. And the armored regimental commanders, of course, do not love this at all. They're driving around at night. How are they going to navigate? Will they see what will happen? There's so many tanks, these columns, what will happen? But Simmons refuses, and he just, says, this is how it's going down. This is the attack. This is what you will do. And a tremendous amount of British Army resources are pushed in as well. And of course, after spring and after all these battles, the Canadian Army needs time to rebuild, and it takes to the 8th of August. It takes the 8th of August to push in the British units, and of course to build the what used to be the M7 Priest armored self-propelled artillery pieces, to rip the guns off them, to make them into armored personnel carriers, to fill up basically every single field here with British tanks, with Canadian tanks, with these new kangaroos that will carry the infantry to victory. And thus, the plan for totalized takes shape, and these huge bombing runs are also planned to destroy whatever you see, the fields there with the wooded areas that the German tanks are hiding in. They'll literally blast them right off the face of the earth.
And that's the thing is, we talked about it earlier, is that yes, there's been this tragic loss of life here. Yes, there's been some inexperience shown by some of these Canadian troops. There's been some fierce response and counterattacks by the Germans. But as you've been saying, as we're going through these days, the Germans are pulling their units out. They're pulling them off to Luchich, which is now going considerably, has gone wrong for them. That's now pretty much over towards Mortain and what have you. And yet the Canadians, the Allies, your first show on World War II TV, an army of never-ending supply, the Allies have been able to replace the Shermans they've lost. They're able to replace the gear that's been lost. The Germans haven't. Every German vehicle that gets lost, that's it. There's no replacement for it anywhere near Normandy, pretty much. So things are building, and things are pushing to a point where the Allies can have this power to push forward. And as David O'Keefe said, I'm not sure by the time we get to August 8th whether Germans had more than maybe Brad and myself in the front lines in Tilly. Well, that's it. They have been attrited. They're reduced to very, very little. And by the way, that's location there, folks. Exactly where I'll go back, where I'm standing, there's Colin's van there. This is the location for the forthcoming Operation Goodwood Memorial that's being put up. I think it's going to be ready for next year. It's actually kind of in the middle of Goodwood, Spring, Atlantic. It's right in the battlefield. That's where the new monument's going to be. They're going to be putting a tank there. I forget, Colin may remember, although he's gone now, whether they're putting a Churchill or there's a tank going there. But that's the reason I'm high up there. Is I'm on the building sort of debris, the piles of earth they're going to be building this monument out of. So as I let it play there, it swings back round to Tilly-la-Campagne. And as you can see, again, I'm a few feet up. You can see, then there's the replacement for the highway Arthur talked about earlier. I'm looking back towards Tilly-la-Campagne there. And then in a few seconds, we'll bring up the last maps for August the 8th. And yeah, I don't like, Brad is saying I don't like it. I don't like the location for it, Brad. It seems to be, I mean, unless they're going to be talking about all the operations, but we'll see what it'll make or break on what information they put on the information panels there, because Jonathan Ware on Twitter is always talking about how bad some of the information panels are at Hill 112. So we will see who's behind it, what gets said, and what actually will end up being there. But that, nevertheless, is the site of the Operation Goodwood Memorial that's going to be coming next year. So I think we've had enough of that clip now. I'll put the PowerPoint back up, and we'll finish off with the final battle. So here we go with. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. That's what I meant to do. There we go. Right, so back to you, Arthur.
Yes, this is now an entirely British chunk of the front for Operation Totalize. Launched by the 51st Highland Division, the 51st Infantry Division, as well as its 152nd Infantry Brigade, of course, supported by two giant columns of the 33rd Armored Brigade, one with the North Hans Yeomanry on the eastern side, pushing around Tilly-la-Campagne to the east, and to the west, some of the numbered Royal Armored Corps regiments, the 148th and the 144th. And there we see some Canadian tanks getting ready. And there's the Loyal Lancashire. Is that? Yes, Loyal Lancashire Regiment, which became the 148th Royal Armored Corps Regiment, which was a very, very good regiment, and due to the attrition in the British Army was unfortunately disbanded shortly after Totalize. But you see the plan there. These two giant armored columns will drive through with mounted infantry with them, and they'll debust this infantry on their objectives, such as Garcils-Secville and Sintho and other things further to the south. This whole area is guarded by the 10th, 1055th Grenadier-Regiment under, I believe it's Colonel Rossmann of the 89th Infantry Division. Of course, this is a German infantry division raised in Norway without large numbers of armor attached to it, but they still may make a determined defense of Tilly. And so, who is sent to subdue Tilly? The 2nd Battalion of the C4th Highlanders of the 152nd Infantry Brigade are pushed forward under Lieutenant Colonel Andrews. And while the tanks are going beside them, huge numbers of tanks, these giant phalanxes, through the dust and the heat, and to mark the way for the tanks, they have the Bofors anti-aircraft guns firing the tracer just to mark the route, that direction, keep your tank going that way. So the infantry is sort of straitjacketed, is in that they can't really maneuver because they'll get run over by the tanks. And so he pushes his companies forward, 3 companies forward, 1 in reserve, Lieutenant Colonel Andrews. And he pushes it down the railway line, then through a bit of orchards. And he feels, I'll take this new area, this new route that has not been taken by the Canadians. But another terrible result. The Germans, even though they're surrounded, they decide to fight, and they machine gun the C4ths near the railway line and in the orchards. And they halt them. They halt the attack. And the brigadier from the 152nd Infantry Brigade, Brigadier Castle, I believe it's what is his name? Yes, Brigadier Castle. He pushes a company of the 5th C4th Highlanders, the reserve battalion for the brigade. Still nothing. And several 5th D Company, 5th Battalion C4th Highlanders officers are killed attempting to push through an orchard. Still, the Germans are machine gunning them. And this time, the British armor has passed through, and they're already behind the Germans. It's a tremendous, tremendous success. Simmons' plan is working, the first phase 1 of it anyway. And that's another story for another episode of World War II TV. But Castle says, enough of this. And he's bringing in all of the 5th C4th Highlanders for a 2-battalion assault, supported by a massive amount of artillery from the Royal Artillery. But at the same time, he summons armored support, and a squadron of the 148th Royal Armored Corps Regiment simply drives backwards from Garcils-Secville, where it's already debussed its infantry that was carrying forward. And they just drive basically right up the road into Tilly. One troop drives around the moonscape of what's left of the village. They machine gun everything. The Germans, due to the artillery fire and the bombing, of course, there's some heavy artillery bombardment, as well as the aerial bombers. Tilly, of course, is bombed again as a target. But the tanks roll in, and a miracle happens. The Germans start to surrender, and the C4ths push in, and the rest of the squadron from the 148th Royal Armor Corps surrounds the village. There's no escape. This is over for you. There's some kind of surrender negotiation that takes all of 10 minutes, and 30 or 40 Germans crawl out of some holes in the ground and the ruined cellars and from trenches. The rest of them have fled. Of course, they'll be picked up later. The British tanks are just too far in their south. The 89th Infantry Division is disintegrating. And it's a tremendous victory for the British Army, and to the west, the Canadian Army, as they're pushing forward. Totalized in its phase 1, it succeeds in a tremendous, tremendous fashion. And of course, the NATO standard is today for every attack, it's always 3-1, 3-1.
Yep.
And we never see that in Tilly. We always see 1-1, or sometimes attacking even with inferior forces. But now, finally, we see this massive combat power that is the 1st Canadian Army, that is parts of the, that's been taken away from the British Second Army. The British Second Army is fighting in blue coat, but the 51st Infantry Division and the 33rd Armored Brigade, this massive confrontation or concentration of armor that simply pushes through in the middle of the night. It's a fine night for tanks, just as Ken Tout says, as an NCO who fought during that battle, and they get through. And when dawn breaks, it's nothing but victory. And of course, Kurt Myrie goes forward and he sees the 89th Infantry Division soldiers running and just attempting to escape capture. And the battle is turned around, though, by the arrival of the 148th Royal Armored Corps Regiment, which is its curtains for the Germans. Yeah,
and brilliantly presented, and we will have to bring you back and do more about Total Eyes. And Ken Tout, by the way, I knew Ken pretty well from Essex, like I am, and wonderful. Walking the battlefields with Ken was always a privilege around Syntho and Tilly the other village, Saint-Anjan de Cramanil, where he was with the Shermans on August 8th. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, although I'm not going out on a limb. To anyone watching, there are 1,000 stories more interesting than what happened to Michael Wittmann on August the 8th than what happened to Michael Wittmann. This story is more interesting, and it's just, I get so frustrated at how much obsession there is with the ridiculous near-suicidal, whatever it was, bollocks attack that Michael Wittmann did up beside the highway. When you've got stories like this, which bring to an end a 5-battle campaign for one little village, all of that is way more interesting than the death of bloody Michael Wittmann. And I've said it, and what we'll do now is just show that last image of the destroyed village. You talked about it right at the beginning, Arthur, about this little T-junction middle of this village. That you saw the photos of it pre-war. That is it, the end of it. So, you pay tribute to the Canadians who fell in this battle, the Brits who fell as well, and the Germans indeed who were captured and fell. But the French civilians who watched at the end of this, their village didn't exist anymore.
Yes, completely wiped off the face of the earth. And you see the massive power there, the Royal Canadian Artillery and the Royal Artillery and the RAF, and the endless artillery concentrations, and what just reduced to almost a First World War landscape.
Yeah.
But you see, supposedly around Tilly, in the years afterwards, 1946, there was 20 tank hulls just immediately around the village of burnt-out tanks, both German and Canadian and British. And what was I going to say? Yes, it's even when I look on Google Maps right now, it doesn't say Tilly-la-Campagne. It says something else. It's almost as though
Castine-en-Plaine. It's been swallowed up by a bigger. It's like they don't want to rename. I mean, it says it on the sign above it, and it says Castine-en-Plaine underneath. And to show that life goes on, our final bit of footage. It's not the battlefield as such. It's what Tilly is like now. This is actually the first stop Colin and I made. So a completely rebuilt church. There are bits and pieces of existing farm walls around there, but this is the village today. So it's thriving. It's commuter belt for Caen. It's there's Colin going off to have a look at the memorials there, and there's Rue des Liberateurs on the left there. And these buildings around here now, they're either completely rebuilt or they're just based on the locations. But the village still goes on. It still exists, and I'll say once again, this battle at the culmination of 5 battles for this one little village is way more interesting than Michael Wittmann's death. And I'm not going to say his name again now because I've done it. I've made my point. Arthur, I'll extend the invitation to come back, and we can focus on other aspect earlier in the battle. We can go back to July the 25th or July the 31st or August the 1st, or talk about Total Eyes. But for anybody out there, such as Brad, who's on his channel, David O'Keefe, they all agree with me. There's way more of other things going on that are more interesting and worthy of discussion than that incident I just mentioned. So, Arthur, it's been fantastic talking to you. Tell us what's next on the horizon in terms of your books.
Oh, it's the new book with Casemate Publishing, with my wonderful publisher, Ruth Shepard. Ruth, hi, if you're watching. And with the wonderful support of my wife, giving me enough time to write it, is the defeat and attrition of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler-Jugend, which will honestly show the volume 1 will be the period of 7th of June until 12th of June, the battles that occurred, and how the 12th SS Panzer Division, in intense detail that I will provide, was defeated.
And anything that has 12th SS and defeat in the title works well for me, because I'm fed up, as Brad is, with this over celebration just because they wore spotty camo and they were kind of cool looking if you're a Nazi apologist. The 12th SS were bested by the Allies in Normandy, and all this ridiculous celebration of them and it just gets on my nerves. But there, I will hold up your books again. So folks, if you have not yet got these books, definitely go and do so. VerrieRes, Volume 1, Volume 2, links in the description below. Folks, I've got the weekend off, and it's the Philippines week next week. Watch the times, because there's some of them in midday, some of them in the evening. There's various guests going. I'm still trying to get one or two more sorted out, but there'll be Philippines week. But Arthur, it's been great talking to you. Superlative performance so I can't wait to have you back.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think Canadians should remember the village of Tilly-la-Campagne, and that's something that should receive more historical attention. You know, it should become almost like a Dieppe, or a place of ceremony to observe the sacrifice there. And it's my pleasure to be on with your show. You're an amazing host, and it's my pleasure to call you a friend.
Thank you very much. And likewise. And also, folks, there is no real memorial in Tilly-la-Campagne. I mean, there are memorials around it, but in the actual mod, there's not much there. As I said, it's not going to be far away from this Operation Goodwood Memorial, but I think the village itself could benefit if there's anyone out there who knows how to get monuments put up to some kind of monument, or even some explanation panels around the village, because as I said, as Colin and I found out, you can drive up these tracks, you can park there. So some information, there's plenty for Goodwood, but not for this. But anyway, folks, I'll see you all again next week. Cheers, everybody. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV. So enjoy your weekend. Cheers, everybody. Bye.